Hello, human geographers. We are back for our next lecture regarding colonialism and imperialism. So let's get started. First slide tonight, we take a look at a couple different definitions regarding what it is to be a colony and what colonialism actually is. As always with definitions, make sure that you're underlining them, but it's not just enough to only underline. Make sure that you're adding some original content. Provide examples. One thing that I would strongly encourage on these definitions is once you underline the important parts, talk about how you're going to remember that. Create the associations that we use in our vocabulary. How are you going to remember this? All right. So here are our two definitions. A colony is a territory that is legally tied to a sovereign state rather than completely independent. And colonialism is an attempt by one country to establish settlements and to impose its political, economic, and cultural principles in another territory, that territory being a colony. So now that we know what those two things are, let's take a look at the history behind this. So the colonial era, at least for Europeans, begins in the 1400s. And we know that Columbus, his first encounter with Native Americans takes place in 1492. And so that's at least a good jumping off point. And obviously it ramps up significantly later after this. We'll get into some of the major events associated with it. But the establishment of European colonies and the claiming of European colonies begins in the 1400s, and there's three major reasons why. The first is the spread of Christianity. Obviously, we know that Christianity is a universalizing religion, and so part of that is spreading Christianity. Another reason why Europeans tried to establish colonies was for resources. And this especially ramped up during the time of and subsequently after the Industrial Revolution, when the need for resources and the need for markets dramatically increases. But since Europeans needed those raw materials, they sought out colonies for that. And then finally was for power, because there was kind of an equivalence between the amount of colonies that a state had and the amount of power that that state had. And so the two largest colonial empires during the height of colonialism was the British Empire and France. Those two states had the most colonies, thus were seen as more powerful. All right. Good way to remember this are the three G's. All right. There's three words that we're going to use to remember why Europeans sought out colonies. And those three reasons are God, gold, and glory. And so if you remember that, God, gold, and glory, those are the three reasons why Europeans sought out colonies: for spreading Christianity, that is God; resources, that is gold; and the increasing of their power, that is glory. And many of the European colonies that existed in the Western Hemisphere were lost during the 17 and 1800s, which then led to later colonization of especially Africa, as we'll talk about. For example, the United States declared their independence, our independence, in 1776, to give a specific example of that. All right. And again, the largest colonial empire was Great Britain. And at this time, there is a saying that many people have heard regarding the British Empire, and that is, the sun never set on the British Empire. And there's a couple different interpretations that I've read on this. One is the more literal interpretation that due to the large number of colonies that Great Britain had, the sun was always shining at any given point. But there was also a bit more of a figurative meaning regarding it, and that was a suggestion of British superiority and the fact that the British Empire would always remain powerful, that the sun was never going to set on the British Empire, that it was always going to remain powerful. We know that has changed quite a bit. It is still definitely an MDC, a leading country in the global community, but the number of colonies obviously have dramatically decreased. So this is a fun little article. The title of the article is actually what you see at the top. The British have invaded 9 out of 10 countries, so look out, Luxembourg. And it refers to that nearly every country on Earth, with the exception of 22, have been invaded by the British. And so this is a direct quote from the article, kind of clarifying how they determine this. Only a comparatively small proportion of the total actually formed an official part of the empire. The remainder have been included because the British were found to have achieved some sort of military presence in the territory, however transitory, either through force, the threat of force, negotiation, or payment. So they clarify that not all of these countries were actually officially part of the British Empire, but instead that the British have at least occupied each of these territories at some period in time. So it really does give a sense to how powerful the British were during the height of the colonial era. So now we have to talk about imperialism, because a lot of times imperialism and colonialism are mentioned in the same breath. And they are connected, but to be clear, they are two different topics. They're related, but there is a wedge of separation that we have to be able to articulate. So as a reminder, the definition of colonialism is an attempt by one country to establish settlements and to impose its political, economic, and cultural principles in another territory. Now, it doesn't say anything about how inhabited those territories are, or whether another group has already established control in that area. So, imperialism differs from colonialism in that they are establishing control of a territory that's already occupied and organized. So here's the definition. Control of a territory already occupied and organized by an indigenous group. So there's already people there. They already have their system in place. And then another group comes in and takes control of that. And then when you start adding in the fact that they might be imposing their political, economic, and cultural principles in that territory, that's when the overlap takes place between colonialism and imperialism. It is a very fine line that separates them, but is important to understand. Because, for example, some colonies are very sparsely populated. However, what took place when we talk about imperialism, and specifically the example we're going to use, is Africa. Because in Africa, there were already boundaries in place. Tribal groups, ethnic groups knew where those boundaries were. They had been defined, maybe not delimited, maybe not marked on a map, but they knew where they were. It had already been organized, it was already occupied, but Europeans came in and imposed their own boundaries, what we call superimposed boundaries, coming in and placing boundaries on top of boundaries that already existed. So, how did they do that? We mentioned the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference was, and this is a definition for us, a conference regulating European colonization and trade in Africa, held in Berlin, Germany in 1884. It resulted in the scramble for Africa and the subjugation of African nations. And there were 14 countries represented, and I'm going to read those 14 countries to you. I want you to see, is there something in common and some group lacking sitting at this table in Berlin? So here are the countries that were present. Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, which was one state at the time from 1814 to 1905, Turkey, which at that time was the Ottoman Empire, and the United States. Those were the 14 countries present at the Berlin Conference. Now, not all of those established colonies in Africa, but those were the countries sitting at the table negotiating how they were going to divide up Africa. Is there any group that you noticed was not sitting at the table? Hopefully you noticed that not a single African state was sitting there. All right? These were all largely European states, with the exception of the United States, okay, sitting at the table negotiating how to divide up Africa. And at the start of the conference, really it had only been the coastal areas that had been colonized. And this had been colonized well before 1884. All right. Obviously, we know that the African slave trade had been happening for hundreds of years prior to this conference in 1884. All right. But at that time, it had only been the coastal areas, which, as a legacy of this colonialism, when you take a look at the biggest cities in Africa, when you take a look at where many of the capital cities are located, or the former colonial capitals, many of them are coastal cities. And so that's an important legacy to mention. By the end of the conference, however, the interior part of Africa had been carved up, again without regard for the religious, political, and linguistic boundaries, ethnic boundaries as well, that existed in Africa prior to the Berlin Conference. So because they did not take into account those boundaries, these are superimposed boundaries that were placed in Africa. So what was mentioned just a minute ago as a product of the Berlin Conference is the scramble for Africa. I'm not going to read through all of these, all right? However, there are a couple things that I want to point out, all right? Great Britain and France, in much the same way that they had the most colonies globally, also had the most territory in Africa as well. Great Britain, you can see the list of states that are there. It should be noted, and you will see it spatially here in a minute, that Great Britain almost had a completely contiguous line of colonies from the northern part of Africa all the way to the south. Right? It was almost completely contiguous with the exception of one state, Tanzania, which was a colony of Germany. If not for that one colony, it would have been completely contiguous. All right. And so from an economic standpoint for Great Britain, that would have been a huge benefit of European colonization in Africa, all right, for Great Britain. All right. Now, it was not contiguous, but that was something that was almost nearly succeeded by the British Empire. So when we take a look at this, I'll ask a couple questions. First being the usual questions. You know, what type of map are we looking at, and at what scale are we analyzing this? So take a moment, type of map, scale, what are we looking at? We're looking at a choropleth map, state scale, all right, national scale, country scale. And I want you to take a moment and take a look at this, all right, because this is looking at colonies globally. And so we can see a lot of the different colonies. That green color was the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and this is at the time 1914, so just leading into World War I. All right, essentially when the colonization of the interior part of Africa had been completed. The green is Great Britain, the United Kingdom. The lighter shade of purple, the lightest shade of purple that you see on there is France. Right? So take a look at French West Africa. Notice that there's also French colonies in Southeast Asia. We've seen the British colonization of South Asia with India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, but also into parts of Southeast Asia as well. And so there are several different colonies, and you can see, to reference that saying, the sun never set on the British Empire, well, in just about every time zone, there were British colonies. And so the British Empire was by far the largest colonial empire in the world. And this doesn't even take into account, for example, colonies that were under control. Like, for example, the Ottoman Empire, when it collapsed, the area of the Middle East was given partially to the British and placed under a British mandate. So under British control, but not formally a colony. So this doesn't even fully reflect the level of control that the British had in other parts of the world. But it does give you an idea. Take a moment and jot down some observations, jot down a question or two that you have from this image, because I think it's a really good one. All right, and bring those questions to class because I'm interested in what you notice. Regarding the end of colonialism, it's important to note that we really see the end of imperialism and colonialism, at least imperialism, following World War II. All right, with the creation of the United Nations and the establishment of supranational organizations, and it should be mentioned in a good reminder on this particular slide, that the Organization of African Unity was the precursor to the African Union. But one of the goals of the Organization of African Unity was to end colonialism and apartheid in Africa. And so after World War II, we really start to see that ramping up. And you can really see that evidenced by the number of United Nations members from Asia and Africa. In 1945, at the end of World War II, there were only 15 United Nations members from Asia and Africa combined. By the end of 2010, it was 106. Remember that in 2010, there were 192 member states. So more than half of the members are from Africa and Asia. But in 1945, that wasn't the case. All right? And obviously, it should be noted as well that that number has since increased with the creation and the formation of South Sudan. So it's actually now 107 member states from Asia and Africa, and the total number of the UN membership has gone up to 193. Now, there are still colonies today. The U.S. State Department lists 43 different colonies. Typically, though, they're sparsely inhabited, but we'll take a look at them here in just a couple minutes. So we'll come back to this. And so I really like to compare these two types of maps. So again, I'll ask the question, what type of map are we looking at? And yes, there are two types of maps, but they're basically the same type of map, just different time periods. So what type of map and at what scale are we analyzing this? And we've got a choropleth map, national scale, state scale. And I really like this because the choropleth component of this allows us to see former colonies and how the boundaries have shifted quite a bit. So in 1939, again, keep in mind that many of these colonies were dissolved after World War II. So in 1939, these European powers still had many of these colonies. But on the right-hand side, you can see the formation of new states over time, and they actually give you the date of independence as well. So if you zoomed in a little bit closer, you'd be able to see that. And so you can see that the boundaries have shifted a lot, especially in French West Africa. You can see several different states coming into creation. Obviously, we know that other states have joined together, have dissolved. There's been a lot of changing boundaries in different parts of Africa. And it still has continued that way because of, most recently, South Sudan. And this next map that we're going to take a look at is taking a look at the colonies and territorial possessions that still exist today. Again, the U.S. State Department lists 43 colonies that are still under possession of different states. Most of those colonies, as you can see here, are either in the Pacific Ocean or the Caribbean. And again, most of them are, relatively small in terms of population as well as geographic area. There's only one that's listed on here as having more than 1 million people. All right, so fairly small colonies. And the one that is the most populous is a colony of the United States. It's one of our territories. It is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has a population of almost 4 million people, depending on the source that you look at, somewhere in the range between 3.5 million, closer to 4. And that is the largest in terms of population colony that still exists today. And there are several others that are on here that you might be familiar with. Gibraltar is a really interesting example. The Falkland Islands, another interesting example. So there's a lot of different ones that have been and remain to this day controversial in nature. And even beyond just the current territorial possessions, this was a piece, an article about the legacy of colonialism. And the article was titled "Out of Africa?" ? And you can see the headline there says, "Direct investment in African nations in 2011 by the previous colonial rulers." So you can see that many of these European countries have still invested a lot of money in former African colonies. And this will be a vocabulary term later in the school year, but it's worth mentioning now because we have to talk about, and later this year we will, neocolonialism. All right, neo, the prefix, essentially means new or modern. And so there is a topic of discussion about modern colonialism. And the definition of neocolonialism that we will use in class is the entrenchment of the colonial order, such as trade and investment, under a new guise. And it is a controversial topic, to be sure, but even after the European powers have officially left these states, there's still been a lot of economic ties between these two countries, or between former colonial territories and the colonial powers. And it's important to understand what we're talking about here, because understand that these are investments. And what is the purpose of an investment? Is an investment a gift? They're gifting lots of money to African states? Well, no. All right. The expectation with an investment is that there is some kind of return on that investment. And so that's the argument. And it is a controversial one, because some will argue that this is helping many of these African states by having more developed countries invest in them. Others will say that it places a lot of dependence on MDCs, that many LDCs, especially African LDCs, are now still dependent on European MDCs for this money in order to develop. And so it's a controversial topic, but I'm interested. What do you think? Do you think that this is neocolonialism? Or do you think that this is helping to develop these African states? Or is it a little bit of both? What do you think? I'll leave you with that tonight. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and I'll see you in class next day.